I think it's fair to say that for the most part, on this channel, what we discuss is Starship design and development and doctrine. The very theoretical, abstract parts of starships. What we don't really discuss all too much is the real nuts and bolts of how you actually go to building a starship. So now's as good a time as any. Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today we're going to talk about starship construction. Primarily, we're going to be focusing on the 24th century, because that's where the most interesting technology starts coming into play. It's also where most starships are built in the timeline of Star Trek, so it makes a bit of sense. I'll obviously reference back to earlier periods, because starship construction and that infrastructure is obviously way older than just the 24th century. It wasn't built from scratch. So there'll obviously be a lot of legacy infrastructure that will be incorporated into this. But the main reason I want to talk about it, well, two reasons. I want to kill two birds with one stone. Two very popular shorts, you may have seen them. One was on the Eves-type Dominion shipyard, you know, the big giant 20-kilometer one where Dominion battleships are being built. Only a piece of concept art, but a very impressive piece of concept art, and a very fun idea to contemplate. So, if you're very good, I'll treat you to that at the end. And the other thing I want to talk about is dry docks, because whoa boy, did that short generate some controversy. So, those are the two birds I'm going to hopefully kill with this one stone. And then also just talk about starship construction and how it actually works. And also this video is going to serve as effectively a Dominion War special episode, because it's talking about starship construction, which is a pretty essential part of the Dominion War. More than any other conflict in the history of Star Trek, the Dominion War sees the most starships constructed and the greatest industrial competition between the two combatants. So, without any further ado, let's begin. I suppose the first question is, where do you begin with starship construction? This is an excellent question. Obviously, we start at the beginning, but where is the beginning? Well, with starship construction, as it is with any construction project, it's when the ship is laid down. Okay, well, when is that? We can really say when a ship's hull is laid down these days, although actually nowadays ships are constructed in segments and then bolted together, rather than the entire thing being laid out in a warehouse or large construction yard and then the ship built up. So, slightly different, but a ship is defined as laid down when the first keel plate is laid. That's when a ship is laid down. Why am I bringing this up? Well, because in Star Trek, this is actually a bit of a question, because we're going to see a lot of modularly built starships, even in the 23rd century. So, how do we nail down which bit is actually the first bit of the starship? So, I mean, if we were to go back to original series, we'd be looking at what is the most unique part of the ship. So, for example, with the Constitution class, we could actually say, because of how it's constructed, the warp core is an integral part of the ship. It's built into the ship. The ship is actually built around the warp core in the original series. And so we can say, well, when the warp core is delivered and they start building structure around it, that's when it's laid down, because it is a completely integral component. But of course, in Next Generation, your warp core is just a plug-in piece, so you can't necessarily say the delivery of the warp core or the completion of the warp core is when the ship is laid down, because in the 24th century, warp cores are a dime a dozen. Saucers are modular, nacelles are modular, so essentially, going what we know of the 23rd century, where you were building the hull around the warp core, well, let's say that the engineering hull tends to be the most unique part of the ship. So we'd probably say that a ship is laid down when its engineering hull begins construction, because saucer sections and nacelles could go off in any given direction. They're just being mass-produced and, I guess stored in giant warehouses, probably. So, with that in mind, let's now talk about the construction process. A lot of people believe that starships are completely built in space. This is not true. Yes, there's that wonderful time-lapse sequence at the end of Star Trek Beyond, and it's a pretty sequence. It's a nice visual sequence. However, we actually have evidence in next generation that starships are not in fact built in space. In, I believe it's the Booby Trap, Geordi creates a holodeck of the lab where the Enterprise was being designed, and he's looking at the history of the Starship's construction on a computer terminal. We see a orbital picture, a top-down picture of Utopia Planitia shipyards, and that is very clearly on the surface of Mars with very clear, distinctive components of the Enterprise D, which tells us that actually the components were built in gravity. They were then lifted up into space to be assembled. So why would you build a starship on a planet? Why would you build inside of a gravity well? Well, it allows you far better access to personnel and resources. You've got a planet that you can dig up and make uranium plating out of, for starters. More easy access to power. There's also not the necessity to keep everything powered up at all times. Things aren't just going to float away if you turn it off. That's quite helpful as well. You're also protected from solar radiation and other various radiation that is out there in space. Obviously, starships are designed to be resistant to such radiation, but in the early stages of their construction, perhaps certain structural elements or sensitive components might be compromised if they were exposed to just open space. And also it ensures, simply put, a base level of structural integrity. If you've built your starship components inside of a gravity well, they at least have to therefore be rated for whatever that gravity was. Okay, Mars isn't 1G, but it's several Gs, and that means that your ship has a level of structural strength. Now, that doesn't mean that the whole thing is rated for that. So yes, the individual components of the Enterprise D are probably rated for Mars's Gs, Mars's gravity. But that's not to say that when the whole thing is assembled, you could then bring it back down into Martian gravity and it not fall apart. Of course, because you've now changed the actual structure of the thing. But the individual components, like saucer sections, and when the saucer section is your primary lifeboat, that's very important. That is rated for atmospheric survival. Actually, it's still important for the engineering hull to be rated for the same thing, because that might be called upon to not only engage in combat, but maybe go into hazardous environments, like, into a gas giant. And obviously it's going to be way easier if it has to carry less weight and has a greater power to weight ratio than if it was carrying around the saucer section as well. So both sections need to be relatively robust, and so that's why building on a planet is useful. People live on planets, and all the resources you need to build starships are generally going to be found on planets. So what we see with the Enterprise D is that the components were built on the planet's surface and then lifted into orbit, probably by some giant station with a tractor beam. They're then assembled in these quote-unquote dry docks. Because as we all know, when you build a ship, you build it in a dry dock, don't you? Well, no, they don't. When we build a ship, we build them on slipways. Slipways so that they send them plummeting into the water. Very dramatic fashion. However, that tends to be a one-way affair. You can launch a ship from a slipway, you can't put it back in a slipway. Fairly obviously, or certainly not without some significant determination and an awful lot of speed. Okay, slipway isn't a perfect analogy or a perfect term either. I'd happily say construction frame. I think construction frame is sufficient. I don't think this is a dry dock because basically the point of this is to maintain the structure of the ship while it's being assembled, and also, probably the most critical part that people forget, provide power to the ship so that it doesn't have to be powered up while it's either being built or undergoing maintenance, and that also means that it has the necessary power to start up, which is again an important thing, especially if you're starting a reactor from cold. So that's all very important. Let's just wind up this tangent very quickly. What actually is a dry dock? A dry dock is an enclosed environment which would remove starships from its natural environment, i.e. the vacuum of space, just as a modern dry dock would remove a ship from water. Now, these do exist. Two examples. First of all, Starfleet Headquarters by Franz Josef. That's actually a very good design for dry docks. These enclosable spheres around the outside of the station. You can park your starship in there, and that environment can be fully oxygenated. And if someone on the other end of the station wants to launch their starship, you don't have to depressurize the dry dock to do it. Whereas unfortunately, with Earth Space Dock, you do have to depressurize every time someone wants to open the doors. Now, I know you can say, what about force fields? Sure, but you don't really want all that's between people who are not in vac suits and vacuum to be a force field, which, if there's a minor power fluctuation, may temporarily fail and all these people get sucked out into vacuum. You want the doors, but unfortunately, every time you open the doors, you're going to be, so it's a problem. That's why I don't like Earth Space Dock, and I do like Starfleet Headquarters. So moving on from that, we've just talked about those assembly frames, or slipways, whatever you want to call them, but don't call them flipping dry docks, because they're not. We then have to look at, well, when is a ship launched? Now, I think it's probably when nacelles arrive. Again, a lot of graphics tend to depict it that starships are the last thing that is built on a starship is the bridge. That's purely for dramatic reasons. That's because, the bridge is the location, it is the ship. It's the soul of the ship, at least as far as a show is concerned. So it makes sense that for dramatic purposes, for example, in Star Trek Beyond, they show the last thing being the installation of the bridge. But as far as we're concerned, in terms of what is actually realistic and makes sense in the universe, the last thing that's probably going to be delivered to a starship under construction is going to be the warp nacelles, because they are the hardest and most complex components of the ship. They are extremely dense and very time consuming to build, which will follow on to my next point. Replicators. So obviously, replicators have enormous implications for starship construction, potentially accelerating the process. Let's be very clear. You cannot replicate an entire starship. Theoretically, you could, but you'd be waiting on it for literally years. I imagine replicators will perform much like 3D printers. If you ask a 3D printer to produce a very simple component, and then you assemble the components yourself to make whatever you are making, that's going to be way quicker than if you tell the 3D printer to make a very complex object. But we know that in the 23rd century, industrial replicators don't yet seem to be a thing, but they do by the 24th century. Now, the interesting thing is that there is actually a clear point when we see replicators being used in Starship Construction, and that is in the Ambassador class. Yeah, we're talking about the Ambassador class again on this channel. We can't get away from it. So here you'll see a comparison between the warp nacelles of the Constitution and Excelsior class ships. And what you will notice is that actually they're very similarly sized. They're very similar sized. Almost as if the size of warp coils isn't actually going up. Warp coils, they're split into two halves. You have an upper set of coils and a lower set of coils, and they basically form a U shape. Now, as you can see, the size discrepancy between the Constitution and Excelsior, despite the Excelsior being substantially bigger than the Constitution, isn't all that much. Partially how Excelsior makes up for this is the increased volume of the nacelles, because they are longer, so that helps increase things. But the individual warp coils, yeah, they have more warp coils, but actually the individual warp coils aren't much bigger than those found on the Constitution. So we see only an incremental increase. But when we jump to the Ambassador class in 2325, we're going to see an exponential gain. These are giant nacelles. These are huge. They are vast. They are many times bigger than the Constitution and more than double the volume of the Excelsior class. So why is it that Starfleet has gone from this to this? Well, my suspicion is that until the advent of industrial replicators, such nacelles were simply not possible. There simply wasn't enough Viturium Cortinide available for you to make giant nacelles like this. And this would also be a very good explanation for where 23rd century battleships went, or why 23rd century style battleships disappeared. I'm of course talking about ships like the Proxima, the Gemini, and the Atlas. These big, bulky, 4-nacelle battleships. Why did they go? Well, because you have the Ambassador class now, the supercruiser. You can design something at battleship scales, but that actually will still maintain cruiser-level performance through these jumbo nacelles, which are much more efficient overall than having just more nacelles. Those ships have to have more nacelles because they couldn't produce large enough warp coils to make just twin nacelle designs, so they had to make quad nacelle designs. And of course, that was less efficient, more power demand, so on and so forth. So with Excelsior, you see longer nacelles, and that kind of is what allows it to be a supercruiser in its day. But it's Ambassador that takes it to that next level and just completely demolishes the idea of needing these 4-engine battleships ever again. And that's where ultimately the idea of the supercruiser comes from. In many ways, it's once again the constitution of its time. So this amount of Veterium Courtenay, which is the material that makes warp coils, is probably not attainable naturally in just out there in the universe. And if it did, wouldn't have the properties necessary to work as an effective warp nacelle. You probably need to treat it and do some alloying and isotoping and other metallurgy stuff that I don't know. But it is made possible with replicators. You're not at this point replicating hull plating. Maybe later on, come the Dominion War, when they're a little bit more common, you're replicating hull plating. But the greatest advantage of replicators is to create complex, hard-to-find components that you perhaps could not find naturally or even easily synthesize out of pre-existing elements. And so I think ultimately in the early half of the 24th century, your industrial replicators, their main contribution to starship construction is making these warp coils, which are essential to this new design of starship. So the fact that the Ambassador class's warp nacelles are exponentially larger than all of its predecessors is made only possible by replicators. Now, let's just observe here, that does mean that these have a production choke point, because it then becomes a question of, okay, how many industrial replicators do you have? And so that is a natural vulnerability in this system. So while you could go on producing smaller ships with naturally occurring quantities of Veterium Courtenay, you're probably going to be completely reliant on your industrial replicator infrastructure to build larger, more modern ships. And that's perhaps another reason in considering why legacy ships like the Excelsior and Miranda continue to see service and presumably were actually built during the Dominion War. So, replicators play a significant part in starship construction in the 24th century, and critically in the size jump, the scale jump of the 24th century. But of course, the other infrastructure still remains very critical to that overall process. So let's just go over this process, this linear system of starship construction, because effectively you have a production line system versus a handmade system. So rather than just building one and build it in its entirety and then move on, you have separate facilities designed to simply build individual components, and then those components are only brought together at the end. And what this means is that it allows the concentration of specialists and expertise, which, as pointed out by Admiral Xerix, is one of the most important parts of starship construction. The infrastructure is actually not all that important. That can be easily replaced and rebuilt. But the expertise and knowledge in these various facilities, that is indispensable, and that is what makes the difference in terms of starship construction. And what it also does, if you have this production line system, is that each facility frees up space, which means you have a higher rate of productivity. It means that a construction frame or berth is not being taken up with a starship for years and years on end. It's only maybe being taken up in space for a couple months or so before the ship is launched. And then, of course, that chains back through the entire construction process. So that means that the facilities that's building the nacelles, that only has to have the nacelles lying in a lot for so long. That means that people building the saucers or the engineering hull or the sensors, again, they only need to leave these components lying around for so long before it's up and away. And that means that you can have a very rapid construction process. This does potentially mean that you have a just-in-time system of delivery, which again could be problematic. If one part of that system breaks down, then you've got a whole load of starships perhaps just waiting on saucer sections, or, vice versa, or, nacelles or whatever. Might explain where the Curry class came from. So I've talked a lot about this, and basically the inspiration for this was when I did a little trip to Venice with Drakenfell and Italian military archives. We walked around the various museums and the bits of the arsenal that you can actually just get into from the public. And the thing that is unique about Venice, one of my members right now is actually having a full-on aneurysm because I'm talking positively about Venice. You're welcome, Pelion. One of the things with Venice is, of course, it is an area of extremely limited space, and yet it exhibits high productivity, building galleys and galleasses. Galleys are the rowing ships, and galleasses were the ones that more resemble future galleons and such. You sort of scale up. But the point being, Venice has a very limited amount of space, but it needed a lot of ships. So how did it accomplish this? Well, essentially it accomplished this through this production line type system. You had the slipways where the hull was built. Once that hull is built, get it out of there. Get it out of there, get it down, avanti, avanti, come on. And you get it out, you get into the water, and you start moving it down the system. And that then means that, of course, that slipway is free to start on the next hull. Then that hull is passed through a set of towers from which giant cranes were built, and these cranes would lower into place the main mast. So again, you're not waiting for a bit of mast, you just park, drop the mast in, move on. It then moves down to the arsenal, where it is equipped with its modest armament, but it is then armed. And then, essentially, it goes into the main docks and is now in service, ready to go. And this is a very similar model of construction to that of the 24th century. Rather than building an entire ship in one place and having that space taken up for the entire time that you're building that ship, you move it on as quickly as possible so that you enable a higher turnover rate, so that you can get overall more productivity. That is very similar to the model of starship construction in the 24th century, and this applies pretty broadly to almost all combatants in the Dominion War. But now, we can now talk about the Eves class. So, I talked about this in a short, I talked about all the ships that are there, or that could be there. Now, the first question, does it build all these ships? No! No. You are not building those Cardassian ships, you are not building those battleship-sized vessels. You are building, at this facility, the 5 Dominion battleships. That's the job of this facility. You have 15 outer maintenance berths. These are larger berths that would enable the docking of a Dominion battlecruiser or a Cardassian Houtet or Janissary, and I suspect this would allow the maintenance of those vessels. This could serve as a maintenance facilities for those vessels as well, but that primarily its job is to serve as the construction yard for all Dominion battleships. Those 40 additional docking berths are purely for input. This is purely for it to suck in resources to build Dominion battleships, because, look at the size of Dominion battleships. They need all those resources. That's just the input. The 40 docking berths is purely for inputs on this station. That is all it is. This is to build Dominion battleships in an expedited time frame. If it actually was built as the Dominion was planning, then this would be able to churn out Jem'Hadar battleships at an incredibly rapid rate. So, obviously you have these outer construction rings, and these are where the Dominion battleships are assembled. However, You then have an inner carapace. Now, this is probably where the fabrication of the Dominion battleships and their hulls takes place. Then you also have the central habitation ring, which is simply where all the workers live. So that outer carapace, people may live there, but it's primarily going to be for the construction and fabrication of basic Starship components. Again, derived from all these inputs. You've got to bear in mind the design of this station is of course very reminiscent of Terok Nor, Deep Space Nine, which was originally an ore refinery, so it likely has the same capabilities, certainly the same structure as Deep Space Nine, which means it does have ore refineries, which means it can take in raw materials and convert them into starships, basically. Little bit of Dominion plus Cardassian knowledge going on there as well. Yes, it's primarily intended to build Dominion ships, but they're obviously learning from the Cardassian method of starship construction. So you would have the processing facilities for raw materials and then presumably industrial replicators. I think we see them. If you look at the inner habitation ring, there are these weird protrusions that seemingly go to nothing. Obviously, they just point out into the empty void. I think those are your industrial replicators, or the output for the industrial replicators. So that is where perhaps the warp coils are being fabricated and then delivered to the structures of the ships. What this facility would do, it would allow for the centralized and rapid production of Jem'Hadar battleships. Because you're producing all these battleships in one place, all the components are there for it, all the infrastructure is there for it, all the knowledge is there for it, which means that it can be done far faster and far more efficiently than what the Dominion actually did during the war, where they found yards that could take them and would build them there, and it meant that they were all built hodgepodge at various different positions. Obviously, there's a large strategic vulnerability, but we can assume that this place was substantially fortified. And it's a good example of what modern construction infrastructure of the 24th century can look like when built from scratch. So this is the Dominion. There is no capability, or very limited capability, of building Dominion battleships, and they want to build an entire infrastructure chain from scratch, and this is what you get. Most shipyards have a long legacy of infrastructure behind them, of knowledge and expertise, and of facilities that are perfectly capable as they were hundreds of years ago. Because, ultimately, if you are building saucer sections or you're building warp nacelles, whatever it is, while the ships may change substantially, the individual components tend not to all that much, which means that such facilities are still perfectly applicable and useful even hundreds of years later. So for most powers in the 24th century, such an undertaking as the Eves class is completely unnecessary and obviously absurdly expensive. So as impressive as the Eves class is, there's a good reason why no one else has anything like it. Once again, it's certainly a good example of the extreme end of Dominion mega projects and some of the weirder stuff that the Dominions and their Cardassian allies came up with during the war. So, just to round things up, shipyards are more than simply construction frames. They are a whole set of infrastructure and expertise. Construction frames actually only really represent the end of the process. Most starship construction takes place on planets, and dry docks are fully enclosable, pressurizable docks for maintenance of starships. This is a dry dock. This is not. Fight me. So, with that all said and done, thank you so much for watching. I'm sure this has been a very long video. It's certainly a long recording session. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My glorious Navarks, Tully DT, Sean Farrell, Rella, and Macross Schaffer. My commanders, Jeff Hallam, Birdmonster, Adam Bowman, Philip Ty, Mark Philippe, Robert Kahn Strider, Gabe Logan, Martin McConville, Nicholas Walsh, JC Tech Wizard, Alcara Dreamer, Gloom Cookie, Der Monarch, and Jamal Soto. And I salute my Centurions, Marcus Hall, Pendlebury, Ocolcatum Quaesto, Bird of Play D3, John Nicol, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Athes Collection, Marzarine, Tobias Klein, Khan the Skektal Overlord, David Jackson, Guy Haslam, Andy Clark, and Quentin King. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants. Thank you all for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.